Hello again, BookTube. I'm back after I filmed that first part of my mail haul with mostly fiction books. And, well, I tried to chase all my new subscribers away with a 30-minute video right off the bat. But then again, it was a 40-minute video that somehow made me BookTube famous. So, we're going to start off. I'm going to just continue my mail haul, and I got mostly fiction. Though there may be some exceptions. I'm not entirely sure my books are turned away, so we'll react to them together. So the first book is a novel, The City and the City by, is it China Miéville? Miéville? China Miéville? I've heard of this author before. They're a well-respected science fiction, science fiction writer, and I do own at least one of his books on my e-reader, but this book I've heard as well. I've actually heard this praised by Steve Donahue, and I believe it made one of his year-end lists. So I'm not as big a science fiction reader, but I've always wanted to change that, and I find that the description of this book very interesting. It's about, I believe it's about two different cities, so you can see the outline here. You got one city there. Let me hold that better. There we go. Another city down here where they're kind of intertwined or overlapping one another, but somehow there's some kind of taboo about being part of one city and being a part of another. And but then there's a murder that intertwines the two cities and reveals a lot of, I guess, secrets and unearths a lot of, I don't know, yeah, secrets and a whole mystery and whatnot that involves these two cities being intertwined and how it actually works out and whatnot. I don't know if I'm butchering that, but it is a relatively short book. It's under 300 pages, and I would like to give this author a try. So I have the e-reader copy of one of his more famous books. I can't recall was it something station? I don't know, but I would like to give this author a try. So finding that book was great. It was a great find for cheap. Next is a book on myths. So we have Medieval Myths by Norma Laura Goodrich, and the subtitle is Brilliant Recreations of the Great Myths of the Middle Ages from Beowulf to the Cid. And the book is exactly what the subtitle says. It's basically this author's retelling of these medieval myths. And if you go into, and it's published in 1994, and if you see the table of contents, you can see just a whole list of basically the major myth from each country from the Middle Ages, and it gives her a short, like 20-page retelling of each of them. And so we got Beowulf for Scandinavia, Peredu for Wales, Roland for France, Berta of Hungary for France, Serifrit for Austria, Tannhäuser for German, Chachulin, I'm butchering that, I'm sorry, that's for Ireland, Prince Igor for Russia, and the Cid for Spain. And if you know your medieval myths, you will notice that there's a very conspicuous omission from this list, and that's King Arthur. King Arthur is not included in this book at all, and I was very curious about that. But I looked up her profile on Amazon, and I find out that she has a lot of other books specifically based on King Arthur and the Arthurian myths. So seems like this is her book on medieval myths other than Arthur. So she's got one on like the Holy Grail and the Round Table and all these different aspects of the Arthurian myths. I think she even has a book on Merlin, and so that makes sense why Merlin is or why King Arthur and his accompanying mythology is completely absent from that book. Moving on to another novel. This is by Patrick O'Brien. It's called Post Captain. This is the second book in his Aubrey and Matron novel sequence, which goes for 20 bucks, because as you see at the side here, it lists all 20 of them. And I own the first book, Master and Commander. It's on my fiction bookcase, and I have not actually read the novel, but I've heard enough good things about this series that I was compelled to pick up the second book if I enjoy the first one. So that's about as far as I'm going to go. I'm going to read the first book and the second book, and see if I like this series, if it's something that I'm actually willing to commit for another 18 volumes. So finding it for cheap was great. Next, we move on to actually history, but they're history, but they're for children. But I'll explain why I bought these. So this is the Story of the World, History of the Classical Child, History for the Classical Child, and this is Volume 1, Ancient Times, from the Earliest Nomads to the Last Roman Empire, and this is by Susan Wise Bauer. And this is her book of the ancient world. And if you recall, or maybe not, I don't know if I actually talked about it on this channel, I read her adult history of the ancient world, where she basically goes from the earliest point of the civilization all the way to the fall of the Roman Empire, or at least the fall of the Western Roman Empire, so the fall of Rome. And that's like over 3,000 years of history right there. And she's got like a big brick of a 800 plus page book on that very subject, and I read that on my e-reader and I really enjoyed it. I've also read her book on the well-educated mind. That one I also really enjoyed. So I read 2 of Susan Wise Bauer's books last year. So that is why I picked up this volume, because I found out she's an author I really like, and I would find it curious to see how she writes the same history for children, considering it's a fraction of the page. 300 pages compared to 800, but yet it covers the same period of history. But then I also found the second edition, or the second volume, The Story of the World, History for the Classical Child. This is Volume 2, The Middle Ages. And the subtitle is From the Fall of Rome to the Rise of the Renaissance. And that's over 1,000 years right there. And I believe that's supposed to be Robin Hood on that cover there. Well, this cover has the famous story of the founding of Rome with the 2 children and the wolf. And this is also quite short. This is longer than, this is almost 400 pages compared to 300 for this one. Got them both for really, really cheap, and I like this author, so I think she has at least a few more volumes in this series. I think she goes up to 5 volumes, and I never really intended to buy them, but for $1 or so, I'm not gonna pass those up, especially for an author that I really like. We go on to another novel. This is The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker by Tobias Smollett. And this is an author I've heard of before. If you are not familiar, I have this goal of going through the Western canon, and so like basically philosophy, literature, philosophy and literature and history from the earliest time periods all the way to basically mid 20th century. So I made this huge list of books and authors that I would like to read, and Tobias Smollett came up when I was doing research in the 1700s, so in the 18th century, because he was one of the pioneers of the novel form. And I've never actually, well, I'm sure I've heard of this book before, but I don't recall if I have this book on my list or not to read, but I picked it up because of the back calls this says it was published in 1771 and is regarded as Smollett's finest book. And it's basically a collection of letters from a whole bunch of different people, and it's like a satire, and it's full of humor. And it's fairly short, coming in at 350 pages. And Usually, when I'm out buying used books, if I find an English book, like this book was published in English, so an English classic, I'll usually just get the free ebook from Project Gutenberg, or Standard Books also publishes free books in the public domain. So I get all the English books that I can on there because they're free and they don't have any cost. But for some reason, books that are in the 1700s or the 18th century, those books I find that the extra critical apparatus, so introduction, the introduction for this one, I don't know if this one even has that long of an introduction, but yeah, the introduction for this one is very short. But an introduction by a scholar, including a lot of notes. So yeah, there's a number of pages of notes, is actually quite helpful. And so this one for cheap, I was willing to pick it up, even though I saw probably what 4 or 5 Dickens novels, and a few of them I would like to read, and I don't have a copy of. I just pass those by, and I don't bother to pay even a cheap price, because I know I have a lot of more than enough books as it is. So getting a free ebook is a lot easier than having to pay and just stuff my bookshelves up with books that I could get for free on my e-reader. And my same concerns, or my same reason why I picked this one up is why I picked this next one up. This is A Sentimental Journey and Other Writings by Lawrence Stern. So if you're familiar with the literature of the 18th century, Lawrence Stern is the famous author of uh, what is the title of that book? This one should tell me. What is the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy, a gentleman. So I actually have a copy of that book on this shelf. No, let's do this here, right on this shelf here. It's right there, and it's also the same Oxford edition. And I tried flipping through that book as an e-reader, and I found out that just the form factor of the e-reader, or as an EPUB versus the actual physical printing book, it just wasn't working out. So I found this edition of Lawrence Stern's stuff too, and it was short, and I heard that he's a funny author. A lot of this talks about satires as well, because this A Sentimental Journey, I believe, yeah, I believe it's also satire. They call it, it lasted many of its imitators because of the humor and mischievous eroticism that inform Mr. Yorick's travels. I assume Mr. Yorick is the one taking the Sentimental Journey. And the other works that it includes of his are a journey, the Journey to Eliza, a political romance, and sermons. So I guess was he a pastor? Did he write sermons? I don't know. But I know that these are short stories, or short works that I never would really seek out or think to encounter on my own if I was just browsing Project Gutenberg. So picking that up I was willing to do that for cheap. Next we have The Prince by Machiavelli. This is translated by Harvey C. Mansfield Jr. Harvey C. Mansfield Jr., The Prince by Machiavelli. And actually, this is my third copy of this book. But because it's short, I can justify it, because even though I don't like usually don't pick up English classics when I can just get them online, with translated classics like The Prince, I will not only pick up one edition, I try to pick up as many as I can for cheap. And I have 2 editions. One of them is a translation from the 40s. I think it's the the edition that has like the little chicken on there. It's not Signet. Maybe it's Bantam. Yes, I think it's Bantam. The Bantam Mass Market paperback. I have their translation, which is a translation from the 40s, and then I also have an old copy of the Penguin Classic translation from the 60s, the George Bull translation. I've not read either one of them, but because I found this edition, this is translated by Chicago University Press, and this translation is from the 80s, so I think it's 1985 that this translation was published. I'm all for collecting different translations of classical works and just seeing which one I get along with, but then once I've read one of them, then I can compare it to these other ones, because uh, translations are like this book in its original certainly is in the public domain, but I can't read the original by Machiavelli. So I'm completely at the mercy of translators, and I usually prefer modern translations with classical works. So that's The Prince. Next is a book that actually was on my wish list, my book list online. Just have a massive list of books that I want to get at some point, or books to look out for. And it used to be on uh, the book depository, when they had this elaborate system of having a wish list, or where you can have this wish list function and you can organize it into subgroups, and which edition that you wanted, and it was quite good, and that's why but once the book depository shut down, I had to move that all over to Amazon or Goodreads. Goodreads has usually been my go-to now, but haven't really fully moved all that stuff over yet. But this book is on that list, and this is Darkness Visible, A Memoir of Madness. This is by William Styron. And if you recognize that name, this is a relatively popular author of the 20th century. I have a collection of his books on my e-reader, which is Sophie's Choice, The Confessions of Nat Turner, and there's one other one that I'm blanking on. But yeah, I have a collection of his novels on my e-reader. I've not read anything by him, but this is his Darkness Visible is his little pamphlet. Like, this is less than 100 pages, a pamphlet on depression, where he went through a time of really, really bad depression, and he found it. He wrote about his experiences, and it's become a classic in writings about depression. And I find that really interesting because, like in our modern age, depression and just mental health and mental illness has become a lot more prevalent and like put out on center stage. And while that's of course important, and that's really good that we can have these discussions a lot in the open a lot more, it's also led to a lot of self-diagnosis and a lot of vagaries of the term. So, like, what is depression actually? Like, is it just feeling sad, or is it, or like, you're sitting on the couch and you're eating Cheeto dust and you don't have a job and you don't care about your family, or you don't have anyone of significance in your life, and then you say that you're depressed. Well, you're putting out your hashtag about mental health on the internet, and we're all supposed to sympathize with you. Well, in that case, maybe not so much, at least for me. Uh, but this kind of phenomenon of depression, where he's a working author and he's had success in life, and yet he has this spell of, well, on the back it says crippling and almost suicidal depression. So that is the kind of phenomenon of depression that's fascinating to how people talk about and study, and to see like how serious that kind of depression really is. And it's something I want to read. That's why it's been on my wish list. And so I'm glad I found a copy for cheap, because these kind of short pamphlets online can be mind-bogglingly expensive for something so short. So I think it's like, what, almost $20 for a short work like this. Hopefully I'm wrong, but anyways, moving on to the next book. This is also a novel, and I gotta say, this might be the find of the haul for Volume 1 and Volume 2. Though there are some pretty good contenders in that last video. This is Volume 1 of The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Romance of the Three Kingdoms. This is by Lo Kuan Chung. And if you're familiar with Eastern literature, this is one of the classics of Chinese literature. I believe there's two or three other volumes in this series, and it's a classic novel. of Chinese literature from like 1,000 years ago, I think. Don't quote me on that. And could be even more actually than 1,000 years ago. But the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, there's many like classical Chinese, at least there's what, five maybe classical Chinese books or novels that have been written in the past 1,000 or 2,000 years, and this is one of them, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And while Eastern literature does interest me, it doesn't hold my attention so much as Western literature, because Western literature is it's where I live. It's my whole life. It's like I'm in the culture, I'm in Western culture, it's the history of my country or the history of the countries around me. And so, of course, I want to be up to speed on my history of Western literature and Western history first before I start branching out and go into like Chinese history or Asian history or South American history or African history. But when it comes to something like this and a classic work, uh, I can't really pass something like this up. Like I believe I have, was it something something Red Chamber? Another, I have the very first volume that Penguin publishes uh, of their translation of that book, because I found that one used, and I also have the Tale of Genji, which I've shown in my other video that I want to read. So there are some exceptions with me when it comes to Eastern literature. Um, so I don't think I'll seek out the other volumes anytime soon unless I find them used. But finding this almost 700 pages of the very first volume, to me that's a steal. That's a find, because this is a fairly expensive paperback online, and uh, if I end up liking this book, or at least I can sample it and see if I do end up liking it, and if I do want to continue with the series. So I'm very glad to have this. We have two more novels, so if you just hold tight, hopefully I'll get this done before 30 minutes. The next novel is by Walker Percy, and this is his book Lancelot. Lancelot by Walker Percy. And if you're familiar with this writer as well, he is a 20th century novelist. He's famous for The Moviegoer. And I do have a copy of The Moviegoer, and I have not read it myself, but I'm very interested in picking it up and reading it soon. It has been one of the novels that have been sort of nagging on like the peripheries of my reading, where I bought it a few years ago, and it's just one of those books that I have not I've neglected for quite a while. So, but looking through Walter Percy's other books, this is one of the books that appealed to me, because if you're familiar with medieval Arthurian legend, you have Lancelot, and Lancelot is a famous figure, like probably the famous knight of King Arthur's Round Table. And this is his own take on the character, or on at least the idea of the character. And I want to see what he does with it, because one of my goals in my reading life is to read a lot of the medieval Arthurian literature. I own copies of a lot of it, but I have not like sat down and deep dive into medieval literature yet. And then once I'm done with that, I want to move on to a lot of the contemporary or further on prestige or homages to King Arthur and to figures within the King Arthur legendarium. So figures like Lancelot and Merlin and Guinevere and even Tristan and Isolde. Isolde? I don't know if I said that right, but Tristan and Isolde. And yeah, there's a few other figures too, like Gawain as well. And so this kind of thing is right up my alley. It's a novel of his that I would like to read. I don't know if I'll read. Depends if I like this, and if I like A Moviegoer, I might seek out more of his books, but we'll see. And now we're on to the last novel. This is Paradise by Toni Morrison. And this book is directly based off of the book, Brian at Bookish, his video on 20, was it 10 books that you don't have to read, and he chose this book by Toni Morrison for one of the selections, even though it's a shorter book. I guess it's considerably more difficult, and he says that it's his favorite Toni Morrison book, but you don't have to read it if you don't want to, if you don't want to, if you don't think you're ready to tackle this book. But then in Steve's response video, he actually mentioned how this is one of his favorite Toni Morrison books too. And that intrigued me because I do own quite a few Toni Morrison books. I own 4 of her books, but I've never actually read any of them. And this book was never on my radar at all until those 2 videos that I previously mentioned. And so finding a used hardcover for really cheap was, of course, all the incentive I needed to pick it up and give it a read, give it a go. And before I do that, I actually want to show you the really cool. So I have her book Beloved, which is a book that I would like to read. It's usually the book that everyone associates with Toni Morrison, but I also have this really cool edition that I found used. I just pulled it off my bookcase because that's where I'm filming on. This is a collection of 3 of her novels. This is The Bluest Eye, Scylla, and Song of Solomon. And I've never actually seen a volume that collects them all. As you see, I've actually tabbed where each novel is. So this is where one novel begins, and this is where another novel begins. And her books are always relatively short. I don't think she has any chunksters or anything really long. Yeah, this itself is 300 pages. So of course it works to fit some of her novels all into one volume. And I've never seen this before. And The Bluest Eye has been probably the book I'll read first from her. I think she'll be really interesting, a really captivating novelist, because I've heard a lot of good things about her. And she's also the novelist that I probably own the most books from without having actually read her. So with this book, buying this book, this is the 5th novel of hers that I own, and I've not actually read any of her novels yet. So like, what if I read Beloved and I don't end up enjoying her? I'm stuck with 4 other novels of her. But that's not usually, like, that would be the logical way to think, but that's not how I think, because if I read Beloved and I don't end up liking it, I'll still read the rest of the stuff that I own from her, because she is a significant author, and I would like to think that if I don't get along with her, that'll be more on my own end rather than rather than her being an actually poor author. But that's my book haul, and good lord, it's almost 30 minutes again. I'm really trying to chase away my new subscribers. Well, that's it, and we'll see you next time.